I want you to picture something. Picture 6 months of your life, not the casual, forgettable kind of months where you coast and check out at 5. I mean the real kind. The kind where you're eating dinner at your desk 3 nights a week. Where your weekends stop being yours. Where you turn down birthday parties, cancel gym sessions, skip holidays with family, because you are locked in on something that matters. Something genuinely difficult. Something you built from scratch, line by line, formula by formula, idea by idea. Now picture walking into work one morning and finding out that the project, your project, is being pitched to the board of directors. Today. Right now. Without your name anywhere on it. Your slides. Your data. Your thinking. Your 6 months. Someone else's name on the cover page. Now here's the part most people don't see coming. I knew it was going to happen. And I didn't just let it happen. I made sure the conditions were perfect for it to happen. Because buried inside that presentation, in a place he would never think to look, was a flaw that would unravel everything. A single number, quietly wrong in a way that would matter enormously in a boardroom full of people paid specifically to notice things like that. He walked into that room with my work, my confidence, and my stolen credibility. He had no idea he was also carrying my trap. Let me tell you who I am, or rather, who I was at the time this happened. My name is Warren Cross, data analyst. 4 years at a mid-sized tech company, the kind of place that likes to call itself a family in town halls but operates like a hierarchy in practice. You know the type. All-hands meetings with catered breakfast where the CEO talks about empowerment and ownership, and then 6 months later your project ends up with someone else's name on it. I wasn't the loudest person on the floor. I wasn't political. I didn't do the networking lunches or the after-work drinks where the real decisions got made. What I did was work. I was the person people came to when something was genuinely broken and needed to be fixed correctly. Not quickly, correctly. There's a difference, and in data, that difference is everything. I had a reputation for reliability, for quiet excellence, for being the person who could take a problem that had defeated 3 other people and come back 2 weeks later with something clean, accurate, and defensible. That reputation, it turns out, is both an asset and a liability. An asset because it means you get given the real problems. A liability because it means the person above you can take your real solutions and wrap them in their own packaging without anyone blinking twice. The project I'm going to tell you about was called, internally, the Supply Chain Optimization Initiative, which is a dull name for something that was genuinely impressive. The short version, the company was hemorrhaging money through inefficiencies in its supplier pricing model. We were paying outdated contract rates that hadn't been renegotiated since a market shift 18 months prior. Nobody had built a model to quantify exactly how much that was costing us, because building that model properly was hard. It required pulling data from 3 different systems, normalizing it across incompatible formats, writing custom scripts to account for variable delivery windows, and constructing a forecasting layer that could project savings under different renegotiation scenarios. It was 6 months of work. I know because I did it. All of it. Every formula. Every script. Every assumption documented. Every data source verified. Every edge case tested. The headline finding: if the company renegotiated its top-tier supplier contracts using the leverage this model identified, it could conservatively save $4.2 million annually. That's not a small number for a company our size. That's a number that gets you noticed. That gets you promoted. That changes the trajectory of a career. And above me, sitting comfortably in a corner office with a VP title and a confidence that always outpaced his competence, was a man I'll call Mark. Mark was the kind of manager who was excellent at one specific thing: being in the room when things went right and disappearing when they went wrong. He had a talent for language, the smooth, boardroom-friendly kind, and an instinct for packaging other people's ideas in ways that made them sound like his own vision. He wasn't stupid. Don't make the mistake of thinking he was stupid. Stupid people are easy to outmaneuver. Mark was smart in the ways that the corporate world often rewards: politically agile, verbally confident, and utterly unafraid of credit that didn't belong to him. I'd seen him do it before. Smaller things. A process improvement one of my colleagues built. A risk assessment that came directly from our team but got presented upstream with Mark's framing and Mark's name attached. It was always done with just enough plausible deniability, team effort, collaborative output. I helped shape the direction, that nobody could ever quite pin it down. I should have been more careful. But I was focused on the work. That's the thing about people like me, and maybe you recognize this in yourself. We believe, somewhere deep and probably naively, that the quality of the work is its own protection. That if something is genuinely excellent, that excellence will be traceable back to its source. That belief, I was about to learn, is a luxury that not everyone in an organization will extend to you. The first sign was small enough to dismiss. About 3 weeks before the scheduled board presentation window, Mark asked me to share the full project folder with him. The model, the scripts, the slide deck I'd been building, everything. He framed it as preparation. He said he wanted to review the materials so he could speak to them confidently if anyone asked questions upstream. That he needed to be across the detail. That it was standard procedure for anything going to board level. I want to be honest with you about something. I felt uneasy. That specific, wordless unease that lives in your gut and doesn't have a logical argument attached to it yet. I shared the folder anyway, because the logical part of my brain hadn't caught up. Because refusing would have seemed paranoid. Because he was my manager, and in the architecture of a company like ours, that still meant something. The second sign was harder to dismiss. I was copied, then quietly uncopied, on a meeting with the head of operations. The initial calendar invite included me, listed as project lead. Then came a revised invite, sent out 2 hours later, that listed Mark as the sole presenter and reclassified my role as supporting analyst. When I asked about it, Mark said the operations lead preferred a more senior point of contact. It's optics, he said. Nothing changes on the ground. You're still driving this. Optics. That word has done a lot of dirty work in corporate environments. It's the word people use when they want to do something that they know, on some level, isn't quite right, but have decided the cost-benefit analysis lands in their favor. The third sign was unambiguous. I was added to a shared workspace file, presumably by accident, because I doubt Mark intended me to see it, where he had been rebuilding my slide deck. Not reviewing it, rebuilding it. Swapping out my formatting for his, replacing my narrative structure with his language, removing every reference to my name. The data was mine. The analysis was mine. The structure, the logic, the findings. But the presentation was being reconstructed as though it had emerged fully formed from Mark's mind. I sat with that file open for a long time. I want you to understand what that moment feels like, because I think it's important. It's not a hot feeling. It's not rage, at least not immediately. What it is cold, clarifying, like a temperature drop that strips away ambiguity and leaves you with only the facts of the situation, unfiltered. What I felt was not primarily anger. What I felt was the crystallization of a decision. I closed the file. I did not mention it to Mark. I did not go to HR, not yet. I want to be clear about why. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood something about how these situations unfold. If I walked into HR that day and said my manager is stealing my project, the immediate response, before any investigation, before any audit, would be a conversation with Mark. And Mark would do what Mark was good at. He would frame it as a misunderstanding, invoke team ownership, remind everyone of his seniority, and I would end up labeled as difficult, territorial, not a team player. This is the machinery of workplace injustice. It grinds slowly and it grinds in a specific direction, and the person without institutional power loses if they engage with it head-on. I needed something else. I needed to think. About 2 days after seeing that rebuilt file, I was doing a final quality pass on the model, my model, the original, and I found something. It wasn't a mistake I had made carelessly. It was the kind of error that only surfaces when you dig into a specific layer of the data that most people would never think to interrogate. One of the supplier pricing tables I had used to anchor the savings projections was pulling from a source file that had not been updated to reflect a mid-year rate adjustment. The formula was correct. The logic was correct. But the underlying pricing data was stale by 8 months, and in a market that had moved the way ours had, That staleness introduced a significant error in the headline savings projection. By my rough calculation, it inflated the projected annual savings by somewhere between 35 and 40%, which meant the $4.2 million figure was probably closer to 2.6 or 2.7 million in reality. Still meaningful. Still a valuable project. But not the number in the deck. Under normal circumstances, I would have fixed it immediately. Of course I would have. That is what you do. You find the error, you correct it, you update the outputs, you note the change in your documentation, you move on. I did not fix it immediately. I sat with it. And as I sat with it, a thought arrived, fully formed, quiet and very cold. What if I don't fix it? Not as sabotage. Let me be precise about this, because the distinction matters enormously to the outcome, to my integrity, and to how this story resolves. I had not introduced the flaw. I had discovered it. What I was contemplating was not an act of destruction. It was an act of omission. A decision to step back from a situation that had been stolen from me and allow it to play out on its own terms. Mark wanted my project. He could have it exactly as he found it. Here is what I did. Slowly, carefully, over the course of about 4 days. The first thing I did was documentation. I went back through every version history I could access. My personal drive, my local backups, the original scripts with their creation timestamps, the email threads from months prior where I'd shared progress updates. I compiled everything into a folder that established, with forensic clarity, the timeline of authorship. Not for anyone else yet. Just for me. Just to have it, organized and accessible, in the event that it became necessary. This is something I'd recommend to anyone who creates valuable work in a corporate environment, regardless of your particular circumstances. Document your authorship obsessively and back it up offsite. Not because you assume bad faith, but because the absence of a paper trail is how good work disappears without a trace. The second thing I did was subtler. In the working model, the version sitting in the shared drive that Mark had access to, the version that was now being dressed up in his language and his formatting, I removed my name from the visible metadata. The properties, the author field, the revision history that lived in the file's surface layer. If Mark looked, he would see a clean slate. No attribution. He would interpret this as a file that was simply his, or the team's, depending on how he framed it. But, deep in the model, in a comment attached to the specific cell containing the problematic supplier pricing formula, buried inside a nested formula tab that you would only reach if you were deliberately auditing the model's source data, I left a note. It read, Original model authored by my name. Supplier rate table references pre-July adjustment. Verify before final presentation. See backup documentation for complete revision history. 7 lines. Invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. Unavoidable to anyone who was. I want to explain the psychology of this decision because I think it's the part that people misread when they hear this story. This was not a petty act. It was not a vindictive trap designed to humiliate someone. It was a restoration of balance in a situation that had been made radically unbalanced by someone else's choice. Mark had made a decision to take something that wasn't his and present it as his own to people who would make significant organizational decisions based on what they saw. That decision carried risk. Real, quantifiable, professional risk. What I did was ensure that the risk he had taken on came with an accurate receipt. He wanted the upside of my work without the accountability that comes with authorship. The note in that cell was accountability, waiting quietly in the dark. The third thing I did was the most important psychologically. I stopped watching. I did not monitor Mark's preparation. I did not look at the shared workspace again. I did not angle for information about the board date or the presentation logistics. I went back to my regular work, showed up normally, responded to emails normally, behaved like someone who had no idea what was coming, because I genuinely had no idea of the exact shape it would take. I just knew the architecture was sound. There is something almost meditative about a decision that has been made well and then released. You do the work. You position the pieces. And then you let the situation breathe. I had 4 days between completing my preparation and the board presentation. They were the calmest 4 days I had experienced in 6 months. And let me tell you something about Mark in that same window, because I could observe it from a distance. He was moving fast. Too fast. The ambition had telescoped his judgment in the way it always does with people who are better at claiming credit than doing the work. Because when you haven't built something yourself, you don't know where its vulnerabilities are. You can't feel the joints. You can't sense the places where the load-bearing assumptions live. You just see the headline, you see the 4.2 million figure, you see the boardroom moment, and you push toward it. He did not do a technical audit of the model. Of course he didn't. A technical audit would have required him to understand the model, and understanding the model would have required building the kind of knowledge that takes months to develop. He had the slides. He had the executive summary. He had rehearsed the narrative. That was enough for someone who was certain that confidence and seniority would carry the room. It's a very specific kind of arrogance, and I say this without anger. The arrogance of someone who has been rewarded for presentations so many times that they've confused it with substance. Mark was good at the room. He genuinely was. He had a quality of certainty in his voice that made people lean in. Under other circumstances, I might have found that useful. In this one, it was the thing that made the fall inevitable. Because a boardroom of senior executives is not an audience that confuses presentation with substance. Not when the numbers are this size. Not when a CFO is in the room. The night before the presentation, I slept 8 hours. I mention this because it surprises me still. The morning of the board presentation, Mark arrived early. I know because I got in at my normal time and he was already there, which was unusual. He was wearing the suit he saved for client meetings. He had printed physical copies of the deck, the kind of move that signals he'd been coached on executive preferences, or had done it enough times to know the optics of a warm physical document landing on a boardroom table. He looked confident. He looked, if I'm being completely honest, like someone who deserved to be there. I sat at my desk. I opened my work. I did not watch him leave for the boardroom. What I'm going to tell you now, I reconstructed from multiple sources, a colleague who was in the room, the HR documentation I later accessed, and a conversation I had much later with the company's head of finance, who told me what she remembered with a frankness that I didn't expect and deeply appreciated. Mark presented well for the first 12 minutes. That I believe entirely. He had the language down. He framed the initiative with the kind of strategic vocabulary that boards respond to: cost efficiency, competitive positioning, margin expansion, risk-adjusted projections. He hit the 4.2 million figure with the confidence of someone announcing a victory that had already been secured. The first question came from the CFO. She asked him to walk through the methodology behind the savings projection. Specifically, she wanted to understand how the supplier pricing baseline had been established and whether it accounted for the rate adjustments that had taken effect in the second half of the prior year. She had asked precisely the right question. Whether by expertise, instinct, or coincidence, she had aimed her first inquiry directly at the fault line. Mark answered with generality. He spoke about the modeling framework, about the analytical approach, about the rigor of the process. He used the word robust twice. He did not answer the specific question. The CFO pressed. She was not aggressive about it. By all accounts, she was entirely professional, but she was precise. She wanted to know about the rate table. She wanted to know which version of the supplier data had been used as the pricing baseline. Mark did not know. He said he'd need to pull up the technical details. He opened his laptop. He opened the model file, the version that was on the shared drive, the version I had last touched, and he started navigating through it in front of the board. This is the part one imagined most clearly, even though I wasn't there. He's moving through the file, looking for something that sounds like a confident answer. The CFO is watching the screen, which is projected behind him. He's clicking through formula tabs that, if you built the model, you know, like the back of your hand, and that, if you didn't, feel like a foreign language. He clicks into the source data tab. He clicks into the supplier rate table. He sees the comment. According to my colleague who was present, Mark's expression changed in a way that was visible from across the table. Not dramatically, this wasn't a movie, but the quality of his certainty shifted. Something went out of it. Like a light on a dimmer, moved very quickly down. He read the comment. The CFO, whose screen view included the same projection, also read the comment. The comment that said, Original model authored by my name. Supplier rate table references pre-July adjustment. Verify before final presentation. There was a silence of perhaps 5 seconds. In a boardroom, 5 seconds is a very long time. The CFO asked Mark who the named individual was. Mark said I was an analyst on his team. The CFO asked whether that analyst was present. Mark said I was at my desk. The CFO asked if someone could get me. When my colleague came to find me, visibly uncomfortable, clearly not briefed on the full situation, just told that the board meeting needed me, I gathered my laptop, opened the folder I had been maintaining for the past 10 days, and walked into that boardroom with the same measured calm I had been cultivating since the moment I found the error and made my decision. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened next, because I don't want to dress it up in more drama than it deserves. The truth is cleaner and, I think, more satisfying than any dramatization. I showed the board my documentation, the original creation timestamps, the revision history from my personal backups, the email chain from 3 months prior where I had shared a progress draft with my then project lead in another department. I showed them the full timeline of authorship in about 4 minutes, calmly and without editorializing. Then I showed them the corrected figures. I had run the updated model, with the accurate post-July supplier rates, the night before. Not to prepare for a confrontation. I had done it because even after everything that had happened, the habit of getting the numbers right was too deeply ingrained to abandon. The corrected savings projection was $2.6 million annually. Still significant. Still a strong business case. Just honest. The CFO asked me whether I had flagged the data discrepancy to my manager prior to the presentation. I said I had left a note in the model. She looked at the screen. She looked at me. Something in her expression settled. The kind of settling that happens when a person in a senior position realizes they understand exactly what has occurred and are deciding what to do with that understanding. She said, "Thank you. We'll take a short recess." I walked out of that boardroom and back to my desk. I sat down. I put my headphones in. I did not spend the next hour imagining what was happening behind that door, or if I did, I tried not to. What I can tell you is what happened in the days that followed. The presentation was not accepted. The board requested a full audit of the model and its source data before any decisions were made. A compliance review was opened, not of me, but of the submission process and the chain of authorship. HR was involved by end of day. Mark did not get the promotion he had been angling for. He was, within 3 weeks, placed on a formal performance improvement plan that most of us understood to be the institutional language for a managed exit. He left the company 7 weeks after the board presentation. I don't know where he went and I'll admit I haven't looked. Within a month of the audit's completion, which confirmed that the corrected model was sound and that the savings projection of $2.6 million was accurate and defensible, I was offered the project lead role that the initiative had always warranted. I was also given a one-time recognition bonus that I was told, quietly, had been advocated for specifically by the CFO. I accepted both. I've told this story a few times now, and the question I get most often is some version of, "Weren't you afraid? Didn't it feel like gambling?" And I understand why people ask that. On the surface, it looks like I took a significant risk. I withheld a correction to a material error. I allowed a flawed analysis to reach the board of a company I worked for. Depending on how you frame it, that could look reckless or worse. But here's what I'd ask you to consider. I didn't introduce the flaw. I discovered it, as its author, doing the kind of deep quality pass that only the person who built something actually performs. The flaw was going to be presented either way. The only question was whether I would fix it for someone who had taken it from me without acknowledgement, credit, or permission. Whether I would be the silent backstage crew that kept the stolen performance running smoothly. I decided I wouldn't be. But, and this is critical, I didn't make it worse. I didn't modify the data to increase the error. I didn't remove documentation that could have helped Mark catch the issue himself. I simply stepped back from the situation and let it be what it was. The note I left in the model was not a trap. It was the opposite of a trap. It was explicit, plainly worded guidance that any competent person reviewing the model would have found and acted on. Mark didn't find it because Mark didn't review the model. He presented it without understanding it. That is not my failure. That is his. There's a version of this story where I go to HR on day one, where I make noise, document the theft loudly, fight the institutional machine with transparency and volume. And maybe that version works. Maybe in a different company, with a different culture, with a different HR department, it does. But here's what I've learned from 4 years of working inside organizations, and from this experience specifically, the loudest response is not always the most effective one. Power, real, durable, career-shaping power, often accretes quietly. It lives in the quality of your documentation, in the patience of your positioning, in the decision to let someone else's choices illuminate themselves without your interference. Mark didn't fail because I did something to him. Mark failed because he tried to present work he didn't understand, and the world, in the form of a well-prepared CFO with a precise question, asked him to demonstrate understanding he didn't have. I simply ensured that when that moment came, the record reflected who had actually built the thing. The capable, the steady, the ones who actually do the work. We don't always win fast. Often we don't win loudly. But we build a kind of credibility that is very difficult to steal, because it is demonstrated rather than claimed. And when someone tries to wear it like a borrowed coat in a room full of people who can tell the difference, it fits wrong. Every time. The team restructuring that followed was, from what I heard, genuinely better. The people who remained were more careful, more honest about attribution, more willing to let competence speak for itself. Maybe Mark's exit was part of that. Maybe it was coincidence. I don't claim credit for the culture shift. I just did my work. Accurately. With my name on it this time. If this story landed for you, if you recognize something in it, a moment from your own career, a situation where the work was yours and the credit wasn't, I want to hear it. Put it in the comments. Not to vent, though venting is fine too. But because there's a specific kind of validation that comes from watching someone else's version of your story reach its correct conclusion. And there are people in this community who need to hear that justice, when it comes in the workplace, doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a CFO asking the one question the room should have asked weeks ago. Sometimes it arrives in 7 lines of text buried in a spreadsheet cell. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell. The algorithm rewards the engaged, and so do we. Every week, a new story about what happens when the most capable person in the room decides to stop playing small and start playing smart.